wrote this song, Hotel California.
Yeah, I
right?
wrote a large part of it, yeah.
You wrote the music for it?
I wrote all the music for it, yeah.
Wow.
The answer was no. So finally, I don't know who sent who a legal notice or whatnot, but it just came down that there was no, and you're fired.
He was the man behind the solo that defined an era, the guitarist who gave the Eagles their edge and helped turn Hotel California into one of the most iconic songs in rock history. But instead of being celebrated, Don Felder was cast out, fired by fax, erased from the band's story, and left to fight for his name. For years he stayed silent, but when he finally spoke, the truth he revealed about betrayal, control, and power inside the Eagles shocked fans around the world. And what he said changed everything we thought we knew about one of America's greatest rock bands. When Don Felder first walked into the Eagles world in 1974, the band was already climbing towards stardom, but something was missing. Their sound leaned heavily on country rock, smooth harmonies, and catchy storytelling, but they lacked the punch that could carry them into stadiums and radio dominance. Felder brought exactly that. Born in Gainesville, Florida, and raised on a diet of blues and rock, he had the kind of guitar skills that didn't just fill in the background, they transformed everything. From the start, his playing added grit, edge, and a fiery rock presence the Eagles hadn't fully tapped into. He wasn't just another guitarist, he was the piece that completed the puzzle. Fans later remembered that before Felder, the Eagles were good. After Felder, they were legendary. The band's internal structure, however, was far from the free-spirited image people associated with 70s rock. On paper, the Eagles were run like a corporation. Literally, they had a company called Eagles Limited, where every member held equal shares. In theory, that sounded fair. In practice, it set the stage for future battles over power and money. At first, Felder didn't see the cracks. He was just excited to be part of a group that blended talent, ambition, and opportunity. His technical ability allowed him to weave complex solos into what had been straightforward country rock songs, opening the door to a harder, more polished sound that appealed to millions. Tracks like Already Gone, and later One of These Nights, showed the difference his guitar brought. He didn't just play notes, he gave the band a new identity. What made Felder's arrival even more impactful was how quickly he proved his worth. Unlike some session players who might fade into the background, he wasn't afraid to suggest new directions, new riffs, and entirely new musical frameworks. His creativity was relentless. Bandmate Joe Walsh once described him as someone who could sit with a guitar for hours and come back with something unforgettable. That creativity was both a blessing and, as time would reveal, a threat to the balance of power inside the Eagles. Because while Felder thought he was stepping into a group where collaboration and equality ruled, the truth was different. Two names, Glenn Frey and Don Henley, already carried more weight than the others. They were the lead songwriters, the public faces, and the decision-makers. And slowly, they would begin to take more and more control, often at the expense of the rest. Still, in those early days, Felder was focused on the music, not the politics. He wanted to push the Eagles beyond their comfort zone, beyond the country charts, into the world of rock giants. And in just a few short years, he would do exactly that. But success always comes with a cost, and for Don Felder, the very talent that made him indispensable would eventually make him dangerous in the eyes of his bandmates. And soon, one song, one guitar solo, would launch the Eagles into history, while pulling Felder into a struggle he could never escape. By 1976, Don Felder had gone from the new guy in the band to the architect of the Eagles' most iconic sound. That year, he sat at home in Malibu with a 12-string guitar and began sketching out a melody that felt different from anything the band had ever done before. It wasn't polished, it wasn't written for radio, it was raw inspiration. He recorded a demo on a simple cassette and brought it to the group. That demo would evolve into Hotel California, a song that didn't just define the Eagles but defined an era of American rock.
One day I was kind of sitting on this couch in this rental house that I had on the beach in Malibu, and I was sitting there just playing acoustic guitar, and kind of out came that introduction, and I played it and played it. And
the track's slow build, eerie chords, and soaring solo created a mood that was both haunting and unforgettable, and it was Felder's fingerprints all over it. When fans hear those first notes or the dual guitar climax at the end, they're hearing his vision brought to life. Millions around the world know that solo by heart, but few knew the story behind it. and how it would eventually make Felder a target. Inside the Eagles, the success of Hotel California wasn't celebrated as a team victory the way fans might imagine. Instead, it deepened the invisible lines already drawn in the band. Glenn Frey and Don Henley were the dominant voices, steering songwriting, image, and business. To them, Felder's growing importance was both undeniable and inconvenient. He had delivered the music for their masterpiece, but when it came to recognition, he was still treated as secondary. Fans may have believed the Eagles were a democratic band built on harmony, but behind the curtain it was clear Frey and Henley were in charge, and they weren't about to let anyone else share that spotlight equally. Even as the band performed Hotel California to sold-out arenas and the album shattered records, Felder could feel the imbalance. He'd given them the song that elevated the Eagles from a successful band to global icons, yet he had little say in how things were run. The set lists, the interviews, the division of profits, those decisions stayed tightly controlled by Henley and Frey. Felder was praised as a guitarist but dismissed as a partner. In a group that projected the image of brotherhood, he began to feel like an outsider in his own success. What made it worse was the way money and credit were handled. While the Eagles were still technically under the structure of Eagles Limited, the reality was that certain voices mattered more than others. Felder wasn't afraid to ask why. Why did Frey and Henley deserve a bigger cut of the revenue? Why did their creative ideas automatically take priority? Why were other members, including himself, often treated like employees instead of equals? These weren't small questions. They were direct challenges to the power structure. And if there's one thing Henley and Frey didn't tolerate, it was challenges. Still, in 1976, Felder pushed those doubts aside on stage. Night after night, he played that solo exactly the way fans wanted to hear it. Note for note, raw and electrifying. He respected the song and the audience enough not to alter it. It wasn't just music to him, it was proof that he belonged, no matter what politics swirled in the background. But as the band's fame skyrocketed, the cracks in their unity widened. Because while Hotel California gave the Eagles immortality, it also created a power struggle that would eventually tear them apart, and Felder was right in the middle of it. By the late 70s, the Eagles were selling out arenas, topping charts, and living the rock star lifestyle that millions dreamed about. But behind the polished harmonies and stadium anthems, the band wasn't a brotherhood, it was a corporation. Literally, they were bound together under Eagles Limited, a business arrangement that made every member a shareholder. On paper, it meant equality. In reality, it was a battlefield where two voices always carried more weight: Glenn Frey and Don Henley. They had carved out positions not just as singers and songwriters, but as the decision-makers who controlled the group's creative direction, finances, and future. Everyone else, including Don Felder, was expected to fall in line. At first, Felder tolerated the imbalance. He was focused on the music, and as long as his guitar was at the center of the band's biggest songs, he could keep quiet about the politics. But by the early 90s, when the Eagles reunited for their Hell Freezes Over comeback, the stakes had changed. This wasn't just a band anymore. It was one of the most profitable brands in music history. Tours brought in staggering amounts of money, but when the checks were divided, Felder noticed the math didn't add up. Henley and Frey were taking bigger shares than the rest, and nobody could explain why. Felder wasn't the type to sit quietly while others cashed in on his work. He started asking questions, sometimes directly in band meetings, other times privately. Why were decisions about touring, set lists, and revenue being made without input from everyone? Why did Henley and Frey deserve more than their bandmates? To Felder, these were simple questions of fairness. To Henley and Frey, they were challenges to their authority. And in a system built on control, a challenge was the same as a threat. The more Felder pushed, the more isolated he became. Band insiders began describing him as difficult or hard to work with, labels that stuck to him even though his real crime was demanding transparency. Other members like Joe Walsh and Timothy B. Schmidt often stayed neutral, preferring to avoid confrontation. That left Felder standing alone, caught in a silent war he couldn't win. His insistence on equality wasn't just ignored, it was punished. As the reunion tour stretched on, the atmosphere grew toxic. Felder could feel that every rehearsal, every performance, was taking place under a shadow. He wasn't seen as a creative partner anymore, but as an employee who had stepped out of line. The Eagles still sang about harmony, but the truth was uglier. Behind the scenes they were fractured, with Felder boxed into a corner. And then, in 2001, came the blow that ended it all. Without warning, without a meeting, and without even a phone call, Felder received a cold, impersonal fax. It was a termination notice, blunt and final. Just like that, he was out of the Eagles. But Felder wasn't ready to disappear quietly, and what he did next would turn private grudges into a public war that exposed everything fans were never meant to see.
The answer was no. So finally, I don't know who sent who a legal notice or whatnot, but it just came down that there was no, and you're fired.
It's hard to imagine a colder way to end nearly 3 decades of history. After years of writing, recording, and touring with one of the biggest bands on the planet, Don Felder's time with the Eagles ended with the whir of a fax machine. No handshake, no meeting, not even a phone call. Just a blunt typed notice delivered to his office in February 2001, telling him he was done. For Felder, it wasn't just a firing, it was a betrayal, a reminder that in the Eagles, business always came before brotherhood. The fax was the breaking point in a conflict that had been simmering for years. Felder had already grown frustrated with the way Glenn Frey and Don Henley ran the band like CEOs, hoarding both power and profits. When he questioned why they were taking larger shares of revenue despite the group being structured as equal shareholders, his pushback was treated as insubordination. That attitude made him expendable. To Henley and Frey, Felder wasn't a partner anymore. He was a liability. And so, with one piece of paper, they cut him out. But Felder didn't take it lying down. Within weeks, he filed a lawsuit against Henley and Frey, accusing them of breach of contract, wrongful termination, and unfair distribution of profits. Suddenly, the quiet power struggles of the Eagles were front-page news. Fans who thought of the band as a symbol of harmony were shocked to learn about the cold corporate machinery underneath. The lawsuit painted a picture of a group less like a band and more like a ruthless business empire, where loyalty and creativity meant nothing compared to control. The case dragged on for years, exposing rifts that had long been hidden. For Felder, it was never just about money, it was about recognition. He had written the guitar lines that made Hotel California immortal, contributed to countless hits, and helped shape the very identity of the band. To be tossed aside without acknowledgement wasn't just insulting, it was erasing. The lawsuit became his way of forcing the Eagles and the world to admit that he had been essential to their success. The media seized on the drama. Headlines called it one of the most shocking rock feuds of the decade. Some fans sided with Henley and Frey, arguing they had always been the leaders. Others rallied around Felder, pointing out that without his music, the Eagles might never have reached the heights they did. In interviews, Felder remained calm but firm, saying all he wanted was fairness. Yet, even as the case wound its way through the courts, it became clear there would be no full reconciliation. In 2007, after 6 years of bitter legal battles, the case was quietly settled out of court. The terms were never made public, but both sides agreed to move on. For Felder, it wasn't a financial victory, it was a symbolic one. He didn't want back into the band. He didn't want to tour under their control again. What he wanted was respect, and the lawsuit made sure his contributions couldn't be brushed aside or buried in silence. Still, the cost was enormous. The lawsuit ended any chance of repairing his relationships with Henley and Frey. From that moment on, Felder was no longer just an ex-member, he was an outsider, permanently cut off from the group he had helped build. But Felder wasn't done telling his side of the story. If the courts couldn't give him the last word, he would find another way. And what came next would shock the Eagles to their core. When the lawsuit ended in 2007, many thought Don Felder's war with the Eagles was finally over. He had been fired, he had gone to court, and the settlement was done. But Felder wasn't finished. The following year, he struck back with something even more powerful than a lawsuit: his story. In 2008, he released a memoir titled Heaven and Hell: My Life in the Eagles, 1974 to 2001. It wasn't just a book, it was a bombshell. For the first time, a member of the Eagles pulled back the curtain on the band's inner workings, and what Felder revealed stunned even the most loyal fans. The memoir didn't hold back. Felder described in detail how Glenn Frey and Don Henley had slowly seized control of the group, turning what had once been a band of equals into a dictatorship. He wrote about financial disputes, about moments where his ideas were dismissed outright, and about the cold atmosphere that replaced any sense of brotherhood. To Felder, the Eagles weren't just a band. They were a corporation, one that treated its own members like employees. Readers expecting a sanitized rock autobiography got something far more raw, an exposé of how power, ego, and money had poisoned the heart of one of America's most beloved bands. What made the book even more impactful was Felder's tone. He didn't write like a man out for revenge. He admitted his own flaws, his temper, his exhaustion, and the times he overreacted. That honesty gave the memoir a weight it might not have had otherwise. It wasn't just a list of complaints. It was the confession of someone who had lived through both triumph and betrayal. Fans who read it felt like they were finally hearing the unfiltered truth, not the polished image the Eagles had presented for decades. The reaction was immediate. Supporters of Henley and Frey blasted the book as bitter and self-serving, while many others praised it as a brave account of the darker side of fame. What no one could deny was that Felder's words carried weight. He had been there during the biggest moments, from Hotel California to the massive reunion tours. His account wasn't speculation, it was firsthand, and that made it dangerous. Henley's legal team quickly went on the offensive, accusing Felder of breaching his contract by revealing too much. They tried to block certain parts of the audiobook release, and even sought damages, but Felder stood firm, insisting that he had already held back more than fans realized. In interviews, he teased that if he had truly wanted to, he could have written a far harsher book. "If I wanted to, it would be a lot heavier," he said, leaving readers wondering what details he had chosen to keep to himself. The memoir also changed how people looked at the Eagles' legacy. For decades, they had been seen as a symbol of smooth California cool, harmonies, laid-back vibes, timeless songs. After Heaven and Hell, fans realized the truth was far more complicated. The band had been fueled not just by talent, but by relentless conflict, manipulation, and a constant struggle for power. For many readers, Felder's book wasn't just about the Eagles. It was about the price of fame itself, and how even the greatest music often comes from behind-the-scenes turmoil no one wants to talk about. For Don Felder, the memoir wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming his place in history. He had been fired, dismissed, and nearly erased from the narrative. With Heaven and Hell, he made sure that could never happen. His story was in print, permanent, impossible to ignore. When Don Felder walked away from the courtroom and set down his pen after finishing Heaven and Hell, many assumed his career would fade quietly into the background. After all, the Eagles were one of the biggest bands in the world, and being cut off from their brand seemed like a professional death sentence. But Felder didn't see it that way. If the Eagles had stripped him of their stage, he would build one of his own, and that's exactly what he did. In 2012, more than a decade after his firing, Felder released Road to Forever, his first solo album since leaving the band. It wasn't a desperate attempt to chase radio hits. It was a deeply personal record, filled with songs about loss, betrayal, and rebuilding. Lyrics touched on heartbreak, resilience, and the painful process of moving on. Fans who listened could hear a man working through his past, but also refusing to be defined by it. Critics noted that while it didn't dominate the charts, the album had an honesty and craftsmanship that only a veteran musician could deliver. It proved that Felder was more than a footnote in the Eagles' story. He was still an artist with something to say. He followed it up in 2019 with American Rock and Roll, a project that carried even more weight. This wasn't just Felder playing alone. It was a gathering of rock heavyweights. Mick Fleetwood, Sammy Hagar, Steve Lukather, and Chad Smith all appeared on the record, showing that even after years of controversy, Felder still commanded respect among his peers. Few artists could assemble a lineup like that without deep connections and genuine admiration from other legends. The album was a celebration of classic rock spirit, blending new energy with the kind of guitar work Felder had been known for since the 70s. Then came 2025, a milestone year that saw the release of The Vault, 50 Years of Music. Far from a greatest hits collection, it was a carefully curated mix of unreleased demos, polished tracks, and songs that spanned his decades-long journey. Collaborations with members of Toto, Steve Lukather, David Paich, and Joseph Williams gave the project an extra layer of credibility. For Felder, The Vault was less about nostalgia and more about proof. Proof that he wasn't stuck in the past. Proof that he could still innovate. Proof that he could stand on his own without needing the Eagles' name attached. Outside the studio, Felder also built a new life on the stage. While he no longer filled stadiums with hundreds of thousands of fans, he kept a steady touring schedule at theaters, festivals, and classic rock events across the United States. At every show, the centerpiece was always Hotel California. Felder played it with the same precision and emotion as he had decades earlier, never altering the famous solo that fans had come to expect. To him, keeping it intact was an act of respect, not just to the song, but to the millions of people who had carried it in their memories for generations. And while that solo tied him forever to the Eagles, Felder also used his stage time to perform new material, reminding audiences that he wasn't just living in the past. Beyond music, Felder dedicated himself to teaching and mentorship. He hosted guitar workshops, spoke at music panels, and supported free education programs for young musicians. To those who studied under him, Felder wasn't just the man who wrote Hotel California. He was a reminder that survival in the industry required not only talent, but also resilience, independence, and self-respect. His message to the next generation was clear: don't let anyone erase your identity, even when you're working in someone else's spotlight. As Don Felder carved out his solo career, one truth lingered in the background. He could move on from the Eagles, but the Eagles would never move on from him. Every interview, every documentary, every fan question eventually circled back to the same subject: what really happened behind the scenes, and how did he feel about Glenn Frey and Don Henley after everything? Felder's answers were measured, carefully chosen, and often surprising. He no longer spoke with the bitterness that had filled the pages of Heaven and Hell. Instead, he carried a tone of reflection, like someone who had learned that holding on to anger was just another kind of prison. One of the most emotional moments came in 2016, when Glenn Frey passed away. Felder had tried to reconcile with him after his firing, but Frey never responded. Their rift had remained wide and unhealed. Still, when news broke of Frey's death, Felder attended the memorial service. He spoke respectfully to the press, acknowledging Frey's talent and his role in shaping the Eagles' success. But he didn't sugarcoat the truth either. In later interviews, he admitted plainly, "I'm not happy that Glenn died, but I'm not pretending that we were on good terms. There was a gap between us that will never be filled." It was a statement that shocked some fans with its bluntness, but it was also honest. Felder wasn't interested in rewriting history just to sound polite. He believed in telling things as they were, even when the truth was uncomfortable. His relationship with Don Henley remained equally strained. When the two crossed paths at music events, they exchanged only the briefest of courtesies. There were no warm reunions, no signs of reconciliation. Felder later explained that while he still disagreed with how Henley ran the band, he no longer felt the need to relive those battles. "That's in the past," he said. "I choose to live in the present." To some, that sounded like surrender, but to Felder, it was freedom. He wasn't forgetting what happened. He was refusing to let it control him anymore. In recent years, Felder has spoken more openly about forgiveness, but he makes it clear that forgiveness to him isn't about excusing what was done, it's about letting go of the burden. "I don't forgive to make them feel better," he explained in one interview. "I forgive so I don't have to carry the weight anymore." Don Felder's story is unlike almost any other in rock history. He wasn't a forgotten side player or a temporary fill-in. He was the man who wrote the music to the Eagles' greatest song, the guitarist who gave them their edge, the one who turned country rock into something powerful enough to conquer the world. And yet, he was the one cast out, erased, and nearly silenced. That paradox of being essential but excluded is what makes his legacy so complex and so compelling. For millions of fans, Felder will always be the sound of Hotel California. The song is bigger than any band feud, bigger than any lawsuit. Its opening chords are instantly recognizable around the world. Its solo ranked among the greatest in history. Felder could have walked away from music entirely and still been immortalized for that one contribution. But what makes his story remarkable is that he didn't stop there. He kept creating, kept recording, kept touring, even when he no longer had the platform of one of the most successful bands in history. He proved that survival wasn't just about clinging to the past, it was about building something new in spite of it. At 77, Don Felder still walks onto stages with his guitar, still teaches younger musicians, and still proves that his story is more than just an Eagles feud. He's the reminder that sometimes the greatest contributions come from the people pushed to the margins. Felder himself once said, "If it's not in the official record, it's in the music." And that's the truth, because whether Henley and Frey liked it or not, Felder's music is permanent. It plays every night on radios, in arenas, and in the memories of millions. In the end, Don Felder doesn't need the Eagles to validate him. The Eagles need Don Felder to sound like the Eagles. And that might be the greatest revenge of all,